Hello there, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Listening to the Voices in Our Heads. My name is Jenna O'Malley, and I am thrilled to be hanging out with you today, focusing on cyberpunk and more with a dear friend of us. Everyone who's here, you got to go give a follow to John. Let's rock it.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Hey, great to have you here, my friend. Great to have you here. So go ahead and give a little bit of an intro of who you are, what you do, what you write, and where everyone can find you, my friend.
Sure. So my name is John Maly. I have a day job that involves technology and law, and that job is basically studying computer technology patents and figuring out, to what extent they're valuable and used and useful. And then I recently, as a result of that, I've been working on a lot of AI projects. That's obviously, as AI has become more important, it's become something that a lot more companies are pursuing patents on. So I've been doing increasing amounts of work on that. AI is sort of a logical combination of what I studied in college, which was computer engineering and psychology. So I got
intersection. That makes total sense. Is that kind of why you write cyberpunk, I take then? Yeah,
it's interesting. I would say that's a big part of it. I mean, I think the other part of it is that cyberpunk novels were kind of like, as an adult, when I kind of got back into sci-fi, because I was in college for a long time and you were just forced to, some professor points at a book and says, read this or read that. And, when I finally had some freedom and could kind of pick what I wanted to read and got back into sci-fi, I think the stories that most sort of motivated me were, novels by, Gibson and Neil Stephenson and things that were sort of kind of bridged the increasingly wide gulf of surreality between real life and what was happening inside software.
That's a very good way to look at it. And I think that is changing sci-fi more rapidly than sci-fi authors want to admit, myself included there. So with that being said, who's your ideal reader? What do they like? Are they an older sci-fi fan falling in love with newer sci-fi tropes, or are they strictly in the newer school?
I would say that it's anyone who's currently has my voice in their head as they're hearing my words here. The book was written from sort of an interesting background because I got the idea back when I was in law school, and I had this idea of from an old 1959 law review article we were assigned to read. Again, with professors pointing at books and telling you to go read those things. I had this idea.
Pause. A law article?
Yeah, a 1959 Stanford Law Review article. So, like the last place you would expect to find inspiration for a sci-fi novel. So the article was about how you could turn any law into a logical equation. And coming from a computer background, I kind of that was very intuitive to me, and it made me realize just how easy it would be to kind of program jurors and judges to make these sorts of decisions. And it sort of struck me right away that this is probably an inevitability, that humanity will try this, for better or for worse. And so when I finally sat down to write the book after law school, it was this exploration of like, okay, so we've got this, we've got the sort of fast-paced cyberpunk aspect to it. We've also got sort of a John Grisham-esque kind of legal thriller aspect. And what that sort of encapsulates is that we've got this future where technology and the law are totally intertwined. And there's this teen hacker who's nothing more than kind of a small-time petty criminal who just does it for the rush. He gets falsely convicted by an AI that doesn't make mistakes for the murder of 368 people. And so he gets
what?
Yeah. So there's a terrorist attack, and he gets blamed for it. And so he's simultaneously in this position where he's going to prison for something he didn't do. And he also knows that they've stopped looking for the person who actually did this bombing. And that worries him too, because he's got family back in the city that has sort of turned his back on him. So he gets sent off to this prison where the inmates are their own guards. And that's almost its own, that portion of the novel is almost its own genre in some ways. And he has to become the first person to ever escape from it and unite with his crotchety old attorney and figure out what really happened and save the city. And
because it sounds like that there's a lot of like if then A/B tested decisions, and not everything is a stark black and white if then decision. So that kind of feels like the world he's living in a little bit. Is that true?
Yeah, and I think that's the world we're all moving into now, because you know, in the past, the way software was written is it was procedural. So you would have lines like you're talking about. You have do this instruction, then do that instruction. If this is true, then do this instruction. And neural networks don't really work like that. They're these matrices of numbers. And probably the closest human analogy to that would be that, like, you know, your brain is a bunch of brain cells, and they're not all completely interconnected. Some are more strongly connected to this brain cell, some are more strongly connected to this other. And it's the associations between these brain cells that really define who you are as a person, because we all carry around roughly the same number of brain cells. And it's really these interconnections. And so when you talk about artificial intelligence, you've literally got this, it's like an Excel spreadsheet of numbers is kind of what it is.
I was just going to say, it sounds like like an Access database or an Excel sheet. Exactly.
It is. And those numbers represent the weights of connectedness between, you know, nodes in this layer and nodes in that layer. And so it's sort of a more simplified version of how the human brain works. But it creates a difficulty because with procedural code, you step through and you say, okay, this is where this thing went wrong. What's wrong with this line of code? And you can't do that with AI. It's much more of a diffuse, indirect thing. And it's, you know, you don't really know the significance of any given value in that spreadsheet. So you can't just go and change a value. It tends to be a lot more of a black box analysis where it's like, we don't really know what's going on in here, but we know this is the input and this is the output. And now we got to kind of train it until it's giving the right output for this type of input. So,
I'm a former K-12 English teacher. That actually, we come at it from the opposite end of that argument a little bit, because we tend to think you can learn linearly, but you can't.
Yeah, that's true. And sometimes you sort of overlearn, right? Like if you
correct, exactly,
see too many of, you know, this type of scenario, then you start to think that's representative of the world as a whole, and maybe it's not. And so, you know, we got at the sci-fi and the law, and then there's one other aspect that's like threaded through the novel, which is almost like anthropology, where the introductions to each section of the book have these explorations of like some of the more bizarre human justice systems in human history, and sort of talks about each one of those. And over time, you kind of get this thread of you know, commonalities between the justice systems and common flaws that are shared between them too. So I think the societal implications are kind of a third component. But I did the program. I did this when I was in the Stanford's novel writing program, and I was the only person writing sci-fi that year. And so
that does not surprise me, honestly, with the way the fantasy and the self-help trends have gone lately.
Yeah, and so, you know, I ended up in a situation where for 2 years all my critics were non-sci-fi people. So that definitely sort of tempered it into more of a literary novel. So I think it's the end result of that, you know, while it was a lot more challenging for me to kind of try to connect the dots for all the different audiences, I think it's made it a more generally accessible novel than it would have been if I had just written it from the standpoint of this guy with like a computer engineering background. So.
And I think even because of video game storytelling alone, we're starting to see that interweave of genres anyway, as you start to see more cultures, trade tropes, and whatnot too. And with those being said, in a world where futurism's literally changing by the second, or shall we say nanosecond, define how you use that ever changing in your books. Is it literally just addressing the multiple genres, or are you just simply just like, what avenues of approach do you take for that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because, you know, like if you look at the kind of a lot of stuff in sci-fi deals with this almost, you know, singularity level of steepness and things changing, and you've got some population that has to adapt to that. And normally that's happening with the confines of, you know, within the confines of a book. And so you put the book down and that's not happening. And, you know, we as a society are entering into that with AI, where there's just such rapid growth. And, you know, even in the places where AI isn't, you know, causing necessarily a, you know, even when it's primarily a positive influence, it's still disruptive, you know, like with jobs, it destroys some jobs and it creates others. So that chaos that's created is sort of interesting. You know, what I tried to be mindful of, and this is, you know, gets at, I think, one of the reasons that I found cyberpunk kind of an appealing subgenre, is that a lot of sci-fi, you know, in a lot of sci-fi, society is trending toward this dystopian future, or it's already there. And I think that's, you know, relatable for fairly obvious reasons now. But that doesn't mean that a non-dystopian story doesn't have a place and can't kind of change hearts and minds. And I think, you know, there was this thing that had been started called Project Hieroglyph in Arizona, where the idea was that we don't have enough positive, optimistic sci-fi. And how can we kind of change that? And, you know, everybody who was doing futuristic stuff was doing dystopian. And so I tried to approach it from sort of a different angle. I mean, there's certainly dystopian aspects of it, like the prison system and the justice system, but there's also parts of this future that are very, you know, shiny and appealing. So I think, you know, when you're dealing with any kind of rapid change in chaos, you know, it becomes incumbent on you to kind of take firmer hold of the rudder and kind of guide yourself through it, and not sort of count on the normal societal institutions to sort of create a stable environment for you. So that's, you know, I think I approach it optimistically, but at the same time, I think the message of anything that really deals with AI at all now, from a newspaper article to a novel, is that, you know, it's important to learn more about it, because, you know, we've got societal institutions that are very slow to respond and adapt to things, but you don't have to be slow to adapt to respond. You can learn about it and sort of figure out how to put it to work for you and how to master it today.
So my question, I'm asking this from the perspective of someone who left teaching K-12 because of AI abuse. I'm going to call it what it is, to all you high schoolers who are cheating your way through not actually learning how to think for yourself. Do you think that AI should be limited in the way of plagiarism and copyright? And if so, how? If not, why?
So I think should is a difficult question, because, you know, we're not really in an idealized situation, right? Like we can't just set a rule and expect it to be followed, because we're in this situation where there's already kind of this arms race on things that are AI created. And in order to tell something is AI created, the main tool we have to defend against that is another AI that analyzes the work and says, has this been plagiarized? Does it have the hallmarks of, you know, a chatbot generated response? Are the citations real? And that gets you into a tough situation, because, you know, you've got this, you don't necessarily trust the input you're getting. And, you know, and this is something we see with deepfakes too, with, you know, fake videos and news stories.
That's
and
kind of where I started feeling as a teacher, that all I was doing was grading deep fakes. I would literally said that to a former boss. So yes, exactly.
Yeah, and it's tricky though, because you know, your main tool against this is some other AI. And you know, who's to say that
Good luck
you
getting the money to fund that, K-12, just saying.
well, and that's a tricky thing, right? Because there's all these like deep fake detection algorithms and things, but as a consumer, you know, it's sort of like antivirus software. I you know, at least with antivirus software, you know who the sort of trusted companies are because it's been around for decades. You know, with deepfake detection software, it's you have to kind of trust this thing without necessarily knowing how it works. They're not going to disclose how it works, because if they tell you, look, these are the things we detect and this is how we spot them, then that's just going to tell the people who are generating the AI, you know, outputs, it's going to tell them how to work around this detector so it doesn't get detected as easily. So it creates this arms race type situation, and you know, that gets more complicated by the fact that there's only a few companies that are spending, you know, billions of dollars on AI right now. And if you end up in a situation, it's almost like an antitrust situation with like monopolies, where the company that has the technology that creates fake things or artificially generated things is also the same entity that's giving you the tools to detect it. Like,
It's a problem in education already, sweetheart. Their name's
yes,
Pearson.
exactly. Yep. So yeah, so I think like what should be done is it's almost a purely theoretical question, because what's happening now is that, you know, regardless of what laws you even passed in the US, there's going to be offshore AI servers that you can log into and have them generate things. So we're already sort of in this arms race, and I think it's inevitable that it's going to continue. You know, I think it just circles us back to possibly more of a focus on academic ethics, because in the past, you know, plagiarizing was something that was generally really easy to detect. And now it's something that really isn't. So it's suddenly an easier option. And that, I think, is, you know, when there was a fork in the road and you could plagiarize or not plagiarize, and they were very different processes. Now we're in this situation where a student cannot plagiarize, and then they can go out and, you know, do a little bit of reliance on those kinds of things. So it's become less of a binary decision, and it's made it much more muddy and cloudy. And I think it just becomes more important to, you know, kind of the way we teach plagiarism. It's that you're copying someone else's work, and you're sort of harming that person in a way by not giving them credit. Now we have this situation where it's all being fed into generative AIs, and they're learning things, and these people weren't going to get credit for these ideas anyway, just because of how this data has all been fed in. But you're still being lazy and shortcutting, and, you know, not learning what you would learn from actually researching a topic. So I do think, as far as the should aspect of your question, that yeah, we need to kind of revamp how we teach this. And you know, it really is something that needs to be kind of a philosophical lesson, and not purely a rule on a syllabus that's like printed out in a sentence.
And even to carry that over into business realms, to be fair, this is why I really wanted to have you on for this conversation. And I got a little brash, I apologize, but what you're saying applies to owning and running a business. You need to put that on your business syllabus, by that kind of how you feel, and what your stance is what your stance is. But
Yeah,
it's not going away.
That's exactly right. And you know, we're in this situation right now where it's new enough that things are very asymmetric. And you know, you may end up with a manager who knows absolutely nothing about AI, and that manager may have a team of like 5 people, and half of those people use AI a lot in daily life, and half of them don't know anything about it. And so that's another sort of a catch-up situation, right? Like, how do we expect a manager to be able to sort of enforce these rules, or police them, or watch, you know, for violations of such a policy, unless they're, even more well versed in the technology than the actual employees are.
And for us authors, where do you think it has a place? In certain genres, in certain avenues of operating business, or not?
That's a good question. I mean, I think where you see it used least controversially, and where I think it can actually be helpful is very high level brainstorming. So, for instance,
this is very true.
Yeah, and you can brainstorm it at a level of like, I need 20 16th century English names of characters, and of such and such origins or backstory or whatever, and you can go through, and 19 of them are going to be garbage, and then there's one that's like, oh, that fits one of the characters. Maybe I'll grab that name.
That's akin to doing a Google search just faster, is kind of what you're comparing it to.
It very much is. It's. I mean, there's name generator websites that you could use, and you can sort of pick the genre of the name, and you're sort of streamlining that process. I mean, I think where it's a slippery slope, and right now it's not as slippery, right? Because if you ask a generative AI to write a good story, it's still very much lacking right now. Like, the technology is not there. It can't really get the emotion and the continuity and the character, like, thematic arcs. But we are going to enter into a situation in the next few years where that is going to be possible. And, the way I look at it is it's going to be along the lines of computers are going to be able to sort of contrive stories. So if you're doing some reboot of some 1980s movie that's already been rebooted, twice, and you're just going to reboot it again, and AI is going to do a very credible job of that. But that's because the person who was doing the reboot was sort of doing like kind of the monkey work of writing. Whereas things that are really novel and interesting and unique, I don't think you're going to end up in a situation anytime soon where an AI can kind of start to finish do that. But we are going to get into a gray area where it can generate a number of parts of that, and those get rolled in and incorporated, and then it becomes this gray area of, well, if an AI wrote a third of your stuff, then what's sort of your responsibility to disclose, and what's the reader's relationship with a work that's like that. So we're still just sort of, I think, at the outset of this and understanding the problem from a standpoint of ethics and courtesy rights and all the different aspects of it. So it's a very big Pandora's box that we've already opened.
You've seen the law end of it. You work with the patents. I'm sure you see how nuanced and specific the language is. I'm sure it's very legalese, I bet.
Yeah, and it's funny because when you start dealing with creativity and art, the countries, there tends to be a lot of asymmetry between legal systems in that area. Like we have, like in Europe, you've got a thing called courtesy rights, where like if somebody hires an artist to paint a mural on the side of their restaurant, and then a new owner buys the restaurant, they can't just whitewash over the mural like you could do in the US. If you buy a work and you destroy it in some public way, that's considered to like infringe on the artist's rights. And
it doesn't come with the building, quote unquote.
Right. It's not sort of your absolute property. Like you still need to, it's almost like, I don't know, having a kid where if you contributed to it in some way, you still have some, connection to it that stays, regardless of what happens, from a physical standpoint and location and anything else. So, and then we have a thing in like India, where India had this, there was a campaign where a famous Bollywood actor lent his likeness to an AI. And the idea was that you could have this famous guy that lots of people love generate a customized spoken word advertisement for your local, it was sort of like for 7-Eleven kind of places. So you could generate, come to the 7-Eleven on such and such street. It's my favorite one. And this guy would say it. And they immediately had people sort of misusing the AI and having it generate ads for other things. And what's interesting is that India kind of got ahead of it, and they do, I don't know that there's been too many cases that test the effectiveness of this, but they do have like legal code has to do with using people's likenesses in AI. So
that's the next horizon I think a lot of countries are headed to right now. And I wouldn't be shocked if that changes in the next year.
yeah, I think you're right. And, then the question comes up of like, well, what if you're talking about some deceased artist? And, you can imagine in a case where there's a copyright and the family owns it. But if you're an author or you make a movie or you make a song or something and, you die and you don't have any legal like inheritors of your estate and your intellectual property rights, is it then just fair game to come in and kind of like poach your image and make you do whatever ridiculous stuff, whoever?
As someone whose father has been dead for 10 years, you want to give me a heart attack?
Yeah,
that'd be a good way to do it.
It is an alarming thing, and this is an area where I don't think any. I mean, if I'm wrong, I would love to know, but I don't know of any civilization that has actually had to contend with that issue, and because if you can take
not
someone's
outside
voice,
of a novel, guys, I would hate to say it, not outside of fiction.
Yeah, because we have the tools now that you can just roll some person's speech and likeness. I mean, if they've been made enough of an appearance, you've got enough samples to make a 3D model of them and to speech patterns and emotions and things. So that's going to become a really big issue, and I don't see anyone actually making much of an effort to deal with it. I think they're all kind of wringing their hands and saying, this is a really tough problem. I'm glad it's still a few years off.
Let's just sit here and twiddle our thumbs, guys. India's figuring it out, and we're going to just take their idea, apparently. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it is one of the core competencies of the federal government is just sort of wringing their hands and avoiding real problems. So they're going to do a fine job at that, I think.
I taught in education for over a decade. I understand what that meant. Anyway, what are some techniques writers often forget to rely on outside of AI then, do you think?
That's I think categorically when you're sitting down to write, and I think this is true of any sort of creative artistic endeavor, you are looking for, like with any job you sit down to do, you're like, okay, what's the most efficient way to do this? And what we as writers don't like to have to deal with is the fact that there's a lot of writing you have to do that you just throw away that's helping you get to know your characters, get to know the world. You have plot twists that you realize are kind of more thematically significant than what you've already got, and you end up throwing out a bunch of pages. And your logical progression when you sit down to do something like this is to you have this possibly unreasonable hope that, well, I've already been writing for several years, so I think I can probably skip this step. And it's very easy to fall into that trap and skip the stuff that you just write pages and pages that you end up throwing away. And there's lots of techniques that are really useful if you get stuck. Like if you get stuck and you don't really understand what this character's end motivation is, you can kind of do these exercises where you sit down and do Q&A and like, an interview with your fictional character and ask all kinds of questions about their background and, what they want to do before they die and all these things. And you learn a lot. And it's very easy to just skip that and say, I've already got a pretty good idea of this character. I'm just going to run with it. I'm not going to spend a bunch of days or weeks doing all these background brainstorming exercises. And then, the problem is you may not be stuck. So you may not be driven to do those steps, but maybe it takes way longer for you to realize what the character was supposed to be all about from the beginning. And so I think that, the longer we write, the easier it is to kind of be dismissive of those writing prompt type exercises, because you're like, I don't really need a prompt. I know what I want to write. And it's to your detriment. And you end up having to circle back and do it halfway through. And then you realize you should have done it from the very beginning. So I think it's all those brainstorming things that we do that are just, purely throwaway pages to understand stuff better. We don't want to spend a bunch of time on pages that aren't going to make it in. And I think we often have to anyway.
It kind of pays off in your ability to speak on the character's behalf, even if the knowledge that you know doesn't fully reach the readers, I think. Like that rapport is there and the reader can sometimes sense it. So those are epic suggestions all the way around. We have one more question and then we're going to start wrapping up and winding it down. Who would be the person to direct your first movie, video game, or similar?
Wow, that's a great question. Okay, so like I mentioned, there's sort of this, terrible prison section that steers me towards someone like Frank Darabont, with Shawshank Redemption.
Oh, geez, I was just going to say Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah.
Yes, that would
And,
put.
and he also did some Walking Dead.
Movie.
Yeah, he's done some Walking Dead titles too, so that I think it would be a good intersection. And then, I hesitate to just say Spielberg because it's such an obvious choice, but I think if you focus on a particular area of stuff Spielberg has done, I really liked Ready Player One and how that kind of presented.
I was just about to say Ready Player One. Spielberg was like, I'm going to give a love movie to my nerds. Thank you.
Yes. So that I think would be a great, team up. But that's a good question.
Together would be dangerous.
They would be, and I think what I love about those two movies is the sensibility of them, and that is something that I think it's really tough to duplicate, and it's almost tough to quantify. But I feel like the sensibilities of those two movies would be just a great combination if I could kind of have my way.
That would be an epic tagline for your book. Shawshank Redemption meets Ready Player One.
I really wish we'd had this conversation like a year ago before all the.
Start using it. Just drop it once and see what happens. If not, throw it away.
I am typing it in right now.
Wow. You're welcome. Hey, you're the one who said it. I'm just feeding it back to you. Wow, that was amazing.
That was amazing. That's awesome.
So, did you have any questions for me as we wrap up and wind down?
I guess I would be curious as to, as far as what the kind of outer limits of your show have been, like, what do you think has been like the biggest outlier that you really were glad you brought into the show? Like, it wasn't typical.
Let's see. This is season 4.
Mm-hmm.
Season 4, I think. Yeah, season 4. We've talked about concussions. We've talked about family lineages. We've talked about DNA. We've talked about AI. It's like I've had so many different wild, epic, crazy conversations with the writers, with creators. And literally that's why this show is called what it's called. Listening to the voices in our head where creative minds get together and talk about their creative processes in a world not necessarily built for them because, right. Oh my God, the conversations. I just love sitting down with everybody. And as we're getting ready to go into planning a new season here soon, if you're an old bee and you want back on or a newbie hesitating, I have openings for season 5. Heads up.
Very cool.
So, thank you. And that goes to you too. I would love to have you back in a year. Seriously, as like our AI expert, since you're literally on the legal end a little bit with the patents and whatnot. Would love to have you back just as a check-in of how you are, what you have to say on the world of AI is. Any other questions for me? And if not, you can wrap up, my friend, and let us know where to find you, where to get your books and more.
No, that sounds great. I would love to do that. So the book itself, it comes out in 2 days, which is Wednesday, June 5th. And it is going to be available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all the different various bookstores. And your local bookstore should be able to order it too. And for more information, go to John Maly, that's JohnMaly.com. And you can find more news and sign up for announcements and news and things there.
Awesome. And as always, everybody, thank you for hanging with us. Do be glad to share, like, comment more, and take care of yourself. Your voice matters, dang it. Bye!